With me today for the third episode in our employee retention series, I have asked Dr. Kristy Goodwin to come back and chat to us about how we can support our employees' mental well-being, which is something that is incredibly important for so many reasons, including overall well-being in the workplace. So welcome back, Kristy.
Thank you for having me, Julie. It's great to be here.
Pleasure. And of course, we can't just solely focus on, mental well-being in the workplace anymore. We need to approach this holistically, particularly in our digital world, which we're going to talk about. So some background about Dr. Kristy. She's been on the podcast before, so you may have already tuned in, but Dr. Kristy is one of Australia's leading digital wellbeing and productivity speakers. She helps organisations understand the impact technology is having on employees' wellbeing, physical health and productivity, and shares brain-based hacks for peak performance in a digital age. Now, she's my absolute go-to for tips to avoid burnout and understand how our tech habits are impacting our life. Hence, I wanted to bring her back for this really important chat. So I'm going to jump straight into it. From your work, because I know you've been doing extensive work across many organisations, what are you seeing are the main problems in this space, and how do you think that this is impacting employee retention and also, I think, eventually acquisition as well?
I totally agree with that two-pronged issue, that it's an issue currently facing organisations, and it's a future problem if organisations aren't on the front foot and applying really pragmatic strategies to tackle what I'm calling digital burnout. I think most people innately know that their digital habits and behaviours have perhaps slipped into the dangerous, unproductive, stressful territory. And I think there's three chief reasons why we're seeing that. The first one is because during the pandemic, our digital load has increased exponentially. We've got significant research data that tells us that our use of emails, our daily screen time, a study recently published suggested that the average adult was spending 13.28 hours per day on digital devices during lockdown periods. So over 50% of our day has been tethered to screens, both professionally and personally as well. I don't know about you, Julie, but I know my inbox has certainly been bulging during the pandemic. And Microsoft did some really fascinating research, and they actually found that in February 2021, Microsoft users sent and received 40.6 billion more emails than they did in February the year before. So it wasn't a cumulative total, it was just from month to month comparison. And so our digital load has increased. And because we've shifted to hybrid or sometimes even fully remote work, our reliance on digital technologies increased. Communication tools like Slack and Teams saw a 45% increase in usage. But what was really scary was that 42% of those interactions were taking place outside regular work hours. So I think the first thing that we're seeing that's attributed to this digital burnout is our digital load has increased. The second thing that I think is related to this is because we are using digital technologies, because we have distributed teams, what this has perpetuated, it certainly didn't start it off, I think it was present before the pandemic, was what I'm calling the always on culture.
Yes.
We have got people who feel that they need to be signaling, whether it's virtue signaling, but giving tangible measures of their productivity. They want to be seen to be responsive. So they're replying to emails or Slack messages at all hours of the day and night. And this is creating a culture of what I'm calling digital presenteeism, people who are literally switched on and plugged in around the clock. So that's the second issue. And I think the third issue, and again, this was not instigated by the pandemic, but our pandemic hybrid work arrangements have really fueled this, is that we are working in ways that is not aligned to our neurobiology. And what I mean by this is that we have started to adopt work practices that aren't designed the way our brain and body are biologically wired to operate. So, for example, we are multitasking. Again, Microsoft research tells us what we already know, and that is that the preponderance of people on virtual calls are now multitasking. They're triaging their inbox, they're checking their Teams channel, they're doing other tasks, and our brain physiologically cannot multitask. We are working in marathons as opposed to working in sprints. We've got hard evidence that tells us how long we can focus and pay attention, and yet we're trying to push the envelope constantly. And so I think that superstorm of those three factors. Our digital load has increased.
Yeah.
We've adopted or inherited this always-on culture, and we've adopted work practices that aren't aligned with how our brains and bodies are designed.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And those stats that you shared about people being on outside of what's classified as normal working hours, like that's huge.
It is. So a PwC study, and it was actually published earlier in 2021. So it'd be interesting for that data to be see if it was corroborated later in the year, because I actually have a hunch, given anecdotal conversations I'm having with organisations at the moment, that it would in fact be perhaps higher at the moment. But earlier in the year, I think it was around April when this was published, around 37% of respondents said that they felt like they could switch off outside their working hours and make full use of their accrued leave, meaning that a significant proportion of us feel like we can't switch off. And this is, creating a whole range of both mental well-being issues and also physical health issues.
Yeah.
We know that if we're spending more and more time with technology, as we all are, both professionally and personally, there's a displacement effect. There's an opportunity cost. And we know we are not machines. We are not biologically designed to be plugged in, switched on, and processing information around the clock. We actually need both a physical and a psychological break from our work. And that's really hard to do when you're now, I often say, we're now living at work. We've moved into the office if we are working remotely for some of the time.
Yeah.
And this causes a whole lot of, it's digitally depleting to be on all the time. But another issue that we've often overlooked that I think is also fueling this sense of burnout and fatigue and a range of mental health issues is that when we are working at home, we're actually sending confused cognitive associations to our brain. So our brain is constantly scanning the environment for sensory cues, particularly what we see and hear. And all of a sudden, if my laptop's on the kitchen table or on the kitchen bench, or I'm working in my bed, as I know some people have done from time to time, all of a sudden I'm sending really confused or what we call muddled associations to my brain. It's processing what I see and hear and smell and saying, hang on, this is associated with rest and recovery as a place to relax and unwind. And all of a sudden I'm in my Excel spreadsheet or I'm in my inbox. And this is really depleting for the brain. So there are things we can do to sort of counteract that. But I think those factors together are really having a damaging effect on our mental well-being.
Wow, that really rings true for me, because we just touched on it before when we were talking in terms of I've just taken a break away for a week and got away to the country. And the benefit that has done for me in terms of feeling really recharged and re-energized has been amazing, because I let everyone know I'm going away. And initially those first couple of days, there was almost this guilt for not being on. I should check, I should respond. But as I sort of got into the whole relaxation, of course, in terms of what I should be doing, I've just felt so much better and was able to be present in the moment that I should be present in, rather than being there physically, but then thinking otherwise, which, is obviously really depleting. And what you said before about, having a computer in your bed or even like on the couch, because I've recently had surgery. So I've had to do a bit of that, and it has impacted my sleep.
Yes.
And now that you say that, I'm thinking, that's could be why, because now my brain's confused. It's like, well, do you work here or do you sleep here? Like, what's the deal?
Yeah, and you're not the only person. What we're seeing in it, the research is still in its infancy here, but a lot of employees have struggled with their sleep during the pandemic, and there can be some, anxiety or mental health issues closely related to that. So I'm not for a moment dismissing that.
Yeah.
But another plausible explanation, and again, the research is trying to corroborate if this is the case, is that many people, because we were spending inordinate amounts of time on devices, our laptops, our tablets, our smartphones, what happened was our exposure to blue light increased, particularly at nighttime during the pandemic. And so our exposure to blue light not only delays the onset of sleep, meaning it takes us longer to actually fall asleep, but recent research also tells us that exposure to blue light in the 60 minutes before we go to sleep can also decrease the deep and REM sleep stages of our sleep cycle. So this is a phenomenon called wired and tired, where people might have still got the same amount of sleep. Many people said, I was still clocking up the 7 hours that I normally got, but I was just feeling so fatigued. And one of the reasons we're thinking is because that blue light exposure shrunk those restorative phases of the sleep cycle that helps us wake up feeling refreshed and invigorated. So there's so many, I think, cascading consequences because of our digital habits that we're often not even aware of, but can have a really sinister impact.
Yes, I love that saying, wide and tired. And that sort of brings me to my next, I suppose, question for you, because I know you're very passionate about that wellbeing days are not the thing that is going to enable your team to recharge and refuel. And I 100% agree with that. A day is not going to do it. So, and I love what you say in that rest and recovery is a responsibility, not a reward. So I'm keen to understand, like, how do we create a culture of that, and that it is the responsibility of the employer and the leaders to make sure that, rest and recovery is a responsibility, that they ensure that their teams are given the opportunity to have it. I mean, ultimately, you can't make them. People are responsible for doing what they ultimately do. But yes, so can you just share with us a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really, really important.
Yes, and I totally agree. I think token wellbeing days, they're a bit like a Band-Aid solution. They're, I call them a Band-Aid perk. They can be a great circuit breaker, and I'm not for a moment saying we shouldn't have them, but I'm suggesting that they're not the solution. They're not the long-term sustainable solution. If we really want to optimize people's mental health and wellbeing, if we want to boost productivity, we have to swim further upstream, and we have to look at, why are people so digitally exhausted, digitally depleted or burnt out? And I think the two root causes and the things that we can start to tackle, the first one is, do we have manageable workloads? So many people saying, it doesn't matter what productivity system I apply, it doesn't matter how well I look after my well-being. If I constantly have a menu of work tasks that I just cannot complete, then I'm never going to be effective. And that perceived efficacy is really important as a factor for burnout. So I think examining workloads and structures, and this is really hard. As knowledge workers, we often don't have very tangible, explicit measures of our output. Unlike a traditional tradesperson who might erect a wall and you've got very clear, tangible evidence of what they've accomplished in a day or an hour, we don't have those productivity markers as such in a knowledge-based world. So I think we need to have really explicit conversations about the component parts of a task or a project and really clearly map that out. The second thing that I think is happening is that we have developed, and through accident, I think many of us, took our laptops home when we were forced into lockdowns, and we were trying to work out on the go or on the fly about how we make hybrid work. And what I think has happened is we've adopted some unsustainable and some unhealthy digital habits, norms, and behaviors. I had a client just recently telling me that they were having a team huddle at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night because that was the only time they could coordinate diaries. And these are habits that are just not sustainable. So I think, again, looking at what sort of digital practices, norms, and behaviors are we putting in place that might be harming our mental health and also our performance at the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting around the 9 p.m. huddle. So while maybe logistically it might work for people who have children or have other commitments, at night, 9 o'clock's the time to connect. But it's, that's really the time that we should be winding down for sleep if we're going to have an ideal, 7 to 8 hours sleep a night, which is so critical for high performance, for productivity, for mental health, you name it. Sleep is the thing that fuels so much.
Oh, isn't it? And this is a topic I think teams have got to have some really nuanced conversations in this space, because a study that was published just a couple of weeks ago by Future Forum, which is a consortium of large organizations looking at future ways of working, actually commissioned a study, and they found that a staggering 93% of people want flexibility around when they work. A smaller proportion, I think it was 76%, I want to get the statistics right, wanted flexibility around where they worked. Yeah. But overwhelmingly, people want some autonomy over when they work. I think we've all enjoyed the perks of having more flexible work arrangements.
Yeah.
And this presents a whole myriad of benefits, opportunity if you've got caregiving responsibilities. I think from my perspective, the opportunity to structure your workday up so that it suits your biological peak performance window, which we call your chronotype. There's a whole raft of great benefits, but it's also going to present challenges. If we no longer have people walking in the office between 9 and 5 in a fairly predictable linear workday, we've got to come up with work arrangements where we can accommodate that flexibility, but we can also ensure that productivity and performance isn't hampered in any way. So I think it's a really interesting juncture where we're at, where those teams that will thrive and organizations will thrive in this digital space will actually tackle those topics without going back to old ways of working, but looking for strategies that work. And again, this is where technology can play a brilliant role. I'm working with a number of teams at the moment who are actually implementing what we call asynchronous work practices. So instead of that 9 p.m. team huddle, what could have happened if that was a mum that decided she wanted to work late at night because it suited her family arrangements, she could pre-record a video. She could have that video scheduled to be posted on her Slack channel at 8 a.m. the next morning, and she could have a document there with some key questions that people could respond to at a time that suited them. So that whole meeting could have gone asynchronous rather than being synchronous. So there's ways around it, and I think this is where innovative organizations will shine.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, my God, there's so much in that. I could go down a rabbit hole with that one, but yes. That percentage of the 93%, because I know there was some really good research done by a HR conglomerate in the US, I can't remember, Reimagine HR survey in 2021 at the start of the year. There was a high percentage of people who wanted flexibility around the hours that they worked. In terms of that flexibility, it's not necessarily about where they worked, it's about when they worked. But of course, that enables people to basically work from anywhere as well. So if we change our thinking around output to being or measuring productivity to be around output rather than hours spent in the office, those traditional hours. And that's where I'm actually doing a presentation for Business Australia next week, and that's very much around creating alignment with employees now, because it's not a one size fits all. People know they can do things differently and save a lot of time on commute and use that time a whole lot more effectively. So people know they can do it now. So employers that are going to force people back into the office, and there is absolutely a space and a place for office, I believe, and people are craving connection, but not 5 days a week. And not necessarily the hours that traditional employers want done. So, and this is so important in terms of retaining employees, because I'm even seeing it at my circles. People are leaving their employer because they're not getting the flexibility that they need, which is simply maybe to work from home 2 days a week.
Yep.
Or maybe to work earlier and finish earlier, whatever that looks like.
Yep.
People just need to change their paradigm around this.
They do. And I think we need employers to consider that there's reciprocal benefits. If you are creating more
Totally.
flexibility around when people work, you're not being dogmatic saying these are your work hours or this is your roster. And this isn't feasible for all occupations. I acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But where there is some autonomy, there are, as I said, so many benefits. And one of the
Yeah.
key things I've seen with organizations I've had the privilege to work with this year is that when we start to align our work schedule with our biology, when we start to work the way our brain and body as humans and then as a unique individual is our biological blueprint, when we start to work in alignment and in congruence with that, our productivity increases, our well-being is looked after,
Yeah.
because we are basically swimming downstream rather than pushing a boulder up a hill and
Yeah.
working against the way our brains are designed. So I think it's just so important, and there will be incredible benefits for organizations that see the merits in that
Yeah.
flexibility.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, those organizations who are, forward thinking and on the front foot with this are seeing those benefits. And there are a lot of statistics around that are really proving that, particularly like you say, according to your prototype, when you best work, it
Yes.
just makes so much sense just to allow people to do their best work at the time that is enabling them to do that.
Yes.
So,
And studies tell us that even just so a study by McKinsey and Co had participants, they roughly estimated that executives were spending about 5% of their working week in their peak performance hours. So they were getting their most important work done when their energy or their chronotype was at its peak. They increased that just to 20%. So say, could you roughly have one full day in total per week where you are working in alignment with your chronotype? What resulted was a staggering 50% improvement in productivity by just shifting when they were doing particular tasks. So there's a
yeah,
big reward on investment.
huge reward.
Yeah. But that
Yeah.
requires, a revision of when are we scheduling our meetings? If our meetings are happening when most of our team, let's say our team tend to be middle birds, so their energy peaks in the middle of the day, we would be really good to have a block out period for that middle period of the day where team meetings don't take place. We push them to the parameters of the day, so we're not eating into those peak performance hours.
Yeah, I love it. That makes so much sense. Which leads me to my next question around, like, I know you've shared incredible tips already, but are there any specific tips that you can share with employers and with leaders right now to really support the mental well-being of their team as we sort of launch into 2022, and encourage people to think differently in this space so that they can retain and attract top talent to their organization, because it's pretty tough at the moment.
Yes. And I think it will get worse. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. My number one skill or approach that I think organizations really need to consider, and I'm so pleased to see some organizations really embedding this already, is to establish what I call your digital guardrails. So we
Yeah.
need organizations to clearly articulate. This cannot be assumed or implied. We need to clearly articulate what are the norms, practices, and behaviors around communication tools. How responsive do you need to be to emails, internally and externally? How are we going to use Teams or Slack? Have you got a communication escalation plan? So when a critical incident occurs and it does warrant an urgent reply, how will that be communicated to you? So one of the reasons people say they can't switch off is because they worry they'll miss something really important, or they'll be out of the loop. And so we've got clearly articulated parameters around how we'll do that. Even something as simple as your virtual meeting default time, knowing what we know about how the brain finds virtual meetings cognitively depleting. Can we actually just articulate what the rules are? And I think for hybrid work to work, we need to clearly identify those digital guardrails, because my concern is that if organizations aren't going to articulate these, I think we will soon see legislation, and we've seen it in Portugal recently. The Victorian Police Force have got some regulation around this. We will see, I think, legislation actually prescribing the right to disconnect. So I really encourage organizations to take the first step and actually clearly put in place and this has to be co-constructed. This is not an executive decision or a document or a policy. It's something that teams have to co-construct. So there's clear parameters around our use of digital. The next thing, and I touched on this before, and I'm so glad you said what you said about focusing on outcomes, not hours. We've got to have manageable workloads. We've got to critically assess what it is we're expecting, particularly knowledge workers, to accomplish. And again, delineate what a finished project or a finished task actually looks like. And I think, again, as knowledge workers, this is hard to do. And especially we've almost adopted this outdated industrialized model of productivity where time on task or time working equated to your productivity. And that's not the case for knowledge workers. And I think if we start to acknowledge that we ditch that hours and shift more to an outcomes-based task, what I think that will do is lead to the third thing that I really think organizations need to focus on, and that is building a culture of rest and recovery.
Yes.
A brilliant book by John Fitch called Time Off talks about how we have to have a work and a rest ethic. You cannot inhale if you don't exhale. And you can't ever be fully on if you're never fully off. And I think we need to build, we need to promote workplace cultures that celebrate and talk about rest and recovery as something that is essential. And I think this can start at the top. We need leaders sharing what they did on the weekend or talking about how they took their 2 weeks of annual leave and, not checking their inboxes constantly. It's really hard when your leaders on their annual leave, but they're still firing off emails or replying to your emails. And it creates, because of the way we are as humans, we have mirror neurons and we're wired to be part of a group. We imitate those behaviors. So I really think creating a culture that reveres rather than fears rest is something that is just so important.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is my favorite tip of those three. And you're right, leaders really need to role model that because it does create a level of expectation when leaders are emailing, late at night, early in the morning, whatever that looks like. It's like, oh, well, my boss is doing that. I need to do that too.
Yes.
And it's something I actually really admire my husband for, because when he's on holidays, he's on holidays. He's a, senior leader in an organization, but he switches off. That's like it. Won't answer the phone, won't look at his emails. And I'm like, oh my God, how can you do that? But it's just the habit that he's got in. But also his leaders know that he's on leave. And so they don't try and impact on his time when he's away. So, yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of give and take there. But I think, going back to what you said about the digital guardrails, it's also establishing boundaries too. It's like, it's not okay. It's just not okay to do that in terms of a behavioural sense or from expectation wise as well.
Yes. And I think it's these open conversations that we're having is so, so important. And clearly, when you were talking before about having leaders model this and having your husband being able to switch off because he'd clearly communicated in advance that he was taking his leave. Something I think as part of these digital guardrails is people saying that when you do take your annual leave or when it's a sick day, this is the out-of-office reply that you can put in place. Or some organizations, particularly in Europe, have actually created systems. So when your annual leave, your rostered annual leave takes place, your email access is prohibited and any emails that come to you during your annual leave days are automatically bounced back with a reply that you script. So one of the problems that many people say, I just keep checking on holidays because I don't want to come back on day one after my holiday and deal with the 629 emails that then sit in my inbox.
Yeah.
So I think it's, again, diving deeper into looking at what structures and parameters can we put in place so that people actually can have that full psychological rest. Your husband obviously enjoys the benefits of doing.
Yeah, totally.
And I bet you do too. Like and we know this, interpersonal relationships are so adversely impacted by our use of technology because we can be here but somewhere else, here but there, connected but disconnected.
Yes.
So yeah, it's that double-edged sword.
100%. It really, when you do disconnect, it really enables you to be present in that moment, which is so important, you say, for relationships and just for like your presence of mind, your mental well-being. It's a joy actually
Yeah.
to
And
experience.
And it doesn't always have to. I often say to people, we tackle burnout with three types of breaks. I think the first type are micro breaks. So
Yeah.
you cannot wait till your annual leave to say, I'll just rest and recover then, or I'll rest and recover at the end of the big launch or the end of the project or the deliverable. You have to factor in micro breaks every day,
Yeah.
frequently throughout the day. The next type of break you need is a meso break. So again, a longer stretch, at least a couple of hours where you are fully unplugged and disconnected.
Yeah.
And then also having in those macro breaks as well. And I think when you get those three, you're much more likely to tackle burnout as opposed to just, and that's why I question, we circle back to the beginning of our conversation, the token one-off wellbeing days. They're not going to be the remedy to this problem. It's, I think, more of an embedded cultural shift we need to see taking place.
Yes, totally. And when you're talking about the breaks, and I promise I'll let you go after this. So when you're talking about the breaks, like the macro breaks or micro breaks, is that about just stepping away and being totally disconnected from technology, meaning nothing in your ears, not talking, not listening to podcasts as well? Would that be what you mean?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
So, and I'm the first to admit, sometimes my rest is binge watching really trashy episodes of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Please don't judge me. So you've got to choose your poison. But generally speaking, I say there's some components, and research backs this up. There's some components of a good quality break. The first one is that you do something that is restorative.
Right.
For most people, checking social media, checking a news site, checking your emails is not restorative. So please don't take a break and say, I'll just sit in the sun and do that.
Yeah.
You've got to do something that's restorative. The next thing we need to have, your break, particularly these micro breaks, should have some exposure to natural sunlight. Research tells us that just 40 seconds in natural sunlight will lower our cortisol levels in nature. Yeah, getting outside. Can you walk to the letterbox? Can you stand on your balcony? Can you find the one window in the house where the sun streams in and stand there?
Yeah.
The next component is movement. We know some sort of physical movement will make a whole lot of neurochemicals like endocannabinoids and serotonin and dopamine that will help you feel good and focus and have a restorative effect.
Yeah.
You need, as I mentioned before, nature, if you can, some green time to compensate for your screen time. You should have some autonomy. So there should be some choice over what you're doing in your break. So you are choosing and feeling like you've got some locus of control. And the last thing is connection. We know we as humans are designed to connect. So whether that's a phone conversation with somebody, a chat to the dog, whatever you can do to connect, they're really the ingredients of a good break.
Love it. Restorative rather than depletive. Perfect tips. What a great note to end on, Dr. Kristy. Thank you so much. And I encourage you to really link in with Dr. Kristy. She shares incredible insights, particularly on her LinkedIn, and also there's amazing resources on her website, and also get her in and do some education within your workplaces as well. You certainly will not regret it, and I cannot recommend her highly enough. So thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.